Thinks I to myself, I was born of very honest, worthy, and respectable parents. At least I think so. They were certainly fully as much so as their neighbours. Their circumstances were affluent, their rank in life conspicuous, their punctuality as to the discharge of all just debts and regular payments of their tradespeople unexceptionable. They generally appeared to be regarded by all around them in a very respectable light, being in the habit of receiving and returning, according to the customs of the world, all the usual compliments and civilities of visits, entertainments, etc., etc. Divers personages of all ranks and denominations used occasionally to resort to the house, some in carriages, some on horseback, some on foot, some in formal, stiff, ceremonious manner, some upon a footing of intimacy and equality, some upon special invitation, some quite unexpected. Not having very good health in my early days, I lived much at home, and generally kept my good mother company, so that I was present at most of the meetings and greetings of which I have spoken, privy to all the preliminary arrangements of chosen and select parties, and a witness commonly to the reception given to the several invitations that came from all quarters of the neighbourhood, as Lord and Lady this, Sir Timothy and Lady that, Mr. and Mrs. T'otherthing, etc., 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 all in their turns, and out of their turns, welcome or unwelcome, friends or foes, were in the course of the year admitted or invited to the hall. For we lived, you must know, in a hall. That is, our house was called so. Not when I was born, nor till long afterwards, nor ever very seriously, rather indeed as a nickname than anything else. The case was this. My sister happened to have a correspondent at a school near London, who, finding it essentially necessary to the support of her dignity among her schoolfellows, always directed her letters so. For the parents of one, she found, lived at something house, and of another at what's-its-name place, and of another at Thingamy Lodge, of another at the Grange, of another at the Castle, of another at the Park. Some lived on Mount Pleasance, some on Rose Hills, some on Primrose Banks, some at Bellevues, some in Paracons, some in circuses, some in crescents. In short, all boasted of a title and distinction which our poor old mansion seemed to want. Whether it were the dwelling of a duke or a cheesemonger, it was all one, so that in her own defence she thought it fit to aggrandize her correspondent, in the eyes of her schoolfellows, by conferring a title of some sort or other on our old mansion. And as Hall appeared to be as much unoccupied as any, she determined to direct to us not at simple Grumblethorpe, as formerly, but at Grumblethorpe Hall, which certainly sounded much grander. And for the house's sake I must aver that it deserved a title far more than half the lodges and places and parks and mounts and hills and banks in the kingdom, for it was a regular, good old-fashioned mansion, situated in a very reverend and venerable park, with a stately avenue of lofty elms, reaching near 1/4 of a mile, a handsome terrace in front, and a noble prospect from the drawing-room window, so that I have often thought it no less than a degradation of our venerable residence to be tricked out of it of this manner. But our friend could not, it seemed, well help it. To live at only Grumblethorpe sounded so base in the refined ears of her associates, that she was in no small danger of being contemned and despised for having such a correspondent, especially by Miss Blaze, the daughter of a retired tallow chandler, whose father lived at Candlewick Castle, and who was continually throwing out hints that not to live at a castle, or a park, or a place, or a house, or a lodge, manifestly and unequivocally bespoke so lowly of an origin, and so plebeian a parentage, that for her part she wondered how any person so meanly connected could possibly have found her way to so genteel and select a seminary. In short, our friend found that the only way to allay the degrading suspicion which had been excited was to new name our old mansion, and Grumblethorpe Hall became its established designation. Well, to this mansion, this hall, as I said before, divers persons and personages resorted. The neighbourhood was tolerably large, and the neighbours themselves what is commonly called sociable, so that what with stated and settled and pop visits we were seldom alone. I know not under what particular planet I was born. I never asked any cunning man to cast my nativity, and, not being born under Mercury, I was never cunning enough to find it out for myself. But if there be any one of them that has any peculiar influences in the way of consideration, reflection, or soliloquy, No doubt I was born under that, for being more given to taciturnity than loquacity in my boyhood and early youth, and being sickly besides, the part I generally bore in most of the companies I speak of was to sit quite quiet and make observations and remarks to myself upon the conversation and conduct of others. But by degrees I got into a habit, not only of thinking, but of talking to myself, and if anything was done or uttered at any time that suggested certain unutterable remarks, I fell into that particular state of soliloquy and mental reflection, which I cannot possibly define or describe otherwise than by the vulgar and trite but significant phrase, thinks I to myself. It is past all conception how continually I was driven to have recourse to these mental remarks. Scarcely a word was uttered that did not suggest something odd and whimsical to my watchful mind. Often did it make me quite tremble for fear I should, by any accident or inadvertency, utter aloud what was passing only in my thoughts. I suppose, had it happened, it would at any time and on a sudden have made such a group as nothing but the pencil of an Hogarth could have adequately described. For in our neighbourhood, as in most others, though a very sociable one, the truth is, there were such likings and dislikings, such jealousies and suspicions, such envyings and emulations, such a contrariety of feelings and sentiments, as would have set everything in an uproar in a moment, had not the utmost and most unwearied attention been paid by all parties to the preventing of any discovery of the truth. My poor mother had not a spark of ill nature in her disposition, no pride, no uncharitableness, but was certainly as well-bred and as ready to make allowances for others as most people. But she could distinguish as well as any between agreeables and disagreeables, and be as much affected by them, and thought, I believe, that take it altogether there was rather a predominance of the latter in affairs and occupations and common pursuits of the world. She did not open her mind to me so fully upon the subject as to enable me to state what was the exact nature of her feelings, but I could collect a good deal from her conduct and manner occasionally. The first tendency to indulge myself in the lucubrations and reflections I described arose from the strange circumstances that seemed to me to attend her intercourse with her neighbours, that is, the giving and receiving of visits. One day, when I was sitting quite snug with her, and she was occupied in writing to my sister who was absent from home, I spied at the end of the avenue a group of pedestrians slowly making up to Grumblethorpe Hall, apparently dressed in their best bibs and tuckers for a morning visit. Thinks I to myself, here's some agreeable company coming to my dear mamma. How kind it is of her neighbours to call in upon her thus, and not leave her to mope away her time by herself, as though she were buried alive. Not being willing, however, to run any risk of disappointing her, I waited patiently to see whether they were really coming to the hall, for part of the avenue was the highway to the village. I kept watching them, therefore, with no small anxiety, for fear they would turn away abruptly and deceive my expectations. But when I saw them happily advanced beyond the turning to the village, and was therefore certain that they were really coming to see my dear mother, I hastily turned round to her, exclaiming, "Here's ever so many people coming, mamma," thinking to delight her very heart. "People coming," she says, "I hope not." "Yes, indeed there are," says I. 1, 2, 3, 4 ladies, a little boy, and 2 pug dogs, I declare. "Bless my soul," says my mother, "how provoking. It is certainly Mrs. Fidget and her daughters, and that troublesome child. And now I can't finish my letter to your sister before the post goes. I wish to goodness they would learn to stay at home, and let one have one's time to oneself." Thinks I to myself, my poor mother seems not much to like their coming. I am afraid the Mrs. and Miss Fidgets will meet with rather an unkindly reception. However, I plainly saw that there was no stopping them. They got nearer and nearer. The walking was not over clean, and my mother was the neatest woman in the world. Thinks I to myself, the pug dogs will dirty the room. At last they arrived. The servant ushered them in. Sure enough, it was Miss Fidgets, and the troublesome child and all. Mrs. Fidget ran up to my mother, as though she would have kissed her, so glad did she seem to see her. My mother, bless her honest soul, rose from her seat and greeted them most civilly. "This is very kind indeed, Mrs. Fidget," says she, "and I esteem it a great favour. I had no idea you could have walked so far. I am delighted to see you." Thinks I to myself, she wishes you all at Old Nick. Mrs. Fidget assured her she might take it as a particular favour, for she had not done such a thing, she believed, for the last 6 months, and she should never have attempted it now to visit anybody else. Thinks I to myself, then, Mrs. Fidget, you have lost your labour. And now, she says, how am I to get home again? I am sure I cannot tell, for I really am thoroughly knocked up. Thinks I to myself, my dear mother won't like to hear that. But I was mistaken, for turning to Mrs. Fidget, she said with the greatest marks of complacency, That's good hearing for us. Then we shall have the pleasure of your company to dinner. Mr. Dermont will be delighted when he comes home to find you all here. Oh, you are very good, says Mrs. Fidget, but I must return whether I can walk or not. Only I fear I must trouble you with a longer visit than may be agreeable. The longer the better, says my dear mother. Thinks I to myself, that's a falsehood. While my mother and Mrs. Fidget were engaged in this friendly and complimentary conversation, the Miss Fidgets were lifting up the little boy to a cage in which my mother's favourite canary bird hung, and the boy was sedulously poking his fingers through the wires of the cage, to the great alarm and annoyance of the poor little animal. Thinks I to myself, my mother will wish you behind the fire presently, young gentleman. But no such thing, for just at that moment she turned round, and seeing how he was occupied, asked if the cage should be taken down to amuse him. He is a sweet boy, Mrs. Fidget, says she. How old is he? Just turned 4, says Mrs. Fidget. Only 4, says my mother. He is a remarkably fine, strong boy for that age. He is indeed a fine child, said Mrs. Fidget. But don't, my dear, do that, says she. You frighten the poor bird. As the Miss Fidgets were about to put him down, my mother ventured to assure them that he would do no harm. Pretty little fellow, says she, pray let him amuse himself. All this while the 2 dogs were reconnoitring the drawing-room and furniture, jumping upon the sofa continually with their dirty feet and repeatedly trying to discern, by the application of their pug noses to our feet and knees, who my mother and myself could be, barking besides in concert at every movement and every strange noise they heard in the passage and hall. Mrs. Fidget sometimes pretending to chide them, and my mother as carefully pretending to excuse them with her whole heart. Often did I catch her casting, as I thought, a wishful eye on the letter to my sister, which lay unfinished on the table. Nay, once even, when her attention had been particularly solicited to some extraordinary attitudes, into which the little dogs had been severely bidden to put themselves for her express amusement. But these canine exhibitions were nothing to the one with which we were afterwards threatened. For my mother's high commendations of the little gentleman of 4 years old induced his sisters to propose to their mother that he should let Mrs. Dermont hear how well he could spout. Thinks I to myself in some confusion, spout what? Where? How? I soon found, however, that it only meant that he should entertain us with a specimen of his premature memory and oratorical talents by speaking a speech. Strong solicitations were accordingly made to little master to begin the required display of his rhetorical abilities. But whether it were on account of shyness, or indolence, or sulkiness, or caprice, or in short merely that little master was not in a spouting queue, he betrayed such an obstinate repugnance to the task imposed upon him that it required all the entreaties of the rest of the party to induce him to make the smallest advances toward the exhibition proposed. Each of his sisters went down on her knees to coax him, while Mrs. Fidget huffed and coaxed and huffed by turns, till she was almost tired of it. Now promising such a load of sweetmeats as soon as he got home, if he would but begin, and in the same breath threatening the severest application of the rod if he did not instantly comply. At one time kissing him and hugging him with a, "Now do, my dearest love, be a man and speak your speech," at another almost shaking his head off his shoulders with a, "Stupid boy, how can you be so naughty before company?" At last, however, upon my mother's tapping the pretty child under the chin and taking him kindly by the hand, and expressing, heaven bless her, the most ardent wish and desire to be so indulged, he did condescend to advance into the middle of the room, and was upon the point of beginning, when Mrs. Fidget most considerately interposed to procure him to put his right foot a little forwarder, with the toe more out, and to direct him about the proper motion, that is, the uplifting and down-dropping of his right arm during the performance. One of his sisters, in the meantime, seating herself near to him, for fear of any accidental slip or failure in the young gentleman's miraculous memory. His first attempt was upon Pope's Universal Prayer, but unfortunately of the fourth line he managed constantly to make but one word, and that so odd a one that the sound but ill atoned for the manifest ignorance of the sense. Father of all in every age, in every clime adored, by saint, by savage, and by sage, Jubba Jubba Lord. Jubba Jubba Lord, that was the word, and the only word that could be got out of his mouth, and, thinks I to myself, it would be well if no greater blunders had ever been committed with regard to that insidious line. However, in consequence of this invincible misnomer, the universal prayer was laid by, and other pieces successively proposed, till it was at length unanimously determined that what he shone most in was King Lear's address to the Tempest, and this was accordingly fixed upon as his chef d'oeuvre in the art of oratory. Some preliminaries, however, in this instance appeared to be necessary. It was not reasonable to suppose young master could address a storm without some sort of symptoms, at least, of a real storm. It was agreed upon, therefore, that he should not commence his speech till he heard a rumbling noise proceed from the company present, and we were all desired to bear out our part in the fictitious thunder. How we all thundered I cannot pretend to say, but so it was that in due time, by the aid of such noises as we could severally and jointly contribute, the storm began most nobly, when the young orator stepped forward, his eyes and right hand raised, and his right foot protruded secundum artem. He thus began. Blow winds and cack your cheeks. Crack your cheeks, my love, said his sister in great haste and agitation. What can you mean by cack your cheeks? What that, pray? Ay, what is that? Says Mrs. Fidget. But I believe, ma'am, adds she, turning to my mother, I must make his excuses for him. You must know he cannot be brought yet to pronounce an R. Do all we can, that he always leaves it quite out, as in the case of cack, for crack, or he pronounces it exactly like a W. Thinks I to myself, many do the like. We choose speeches for him, therefore, continues Mrs. Fidget, in which there are many R's on purpose to conquer the difficulty, if we can. Begin again, my dear, says she, and pray remember not to leave out your R's. So he began afresh. Blow winds and quack your cheeks. Quack, says Mrs. Fidget. Why, that is almost as bad. Try again. Blow winds and quack your cheeks. Wage. Wage, my dear, said Mrs. Fidget. Do pray try to say rage. Wage. You catawacks and hurry canoes spout till you have drenched our steeples, drowned the cocks. Bless me, exclaimed Mrs. Fidget. You might as well not speak at all as speak so. I defy anybody to understand what you mean by drowned the cocks. The little gentleman, however, proceeded in spite of the R's. You sulphurous and thought-executing fires, vaunt couriers of oak-cleaving thunderbolts, singe my white head, and thou all-shaking thunder, strike flat the thick rotundity of the world, crack nature's mould, all germins spill at once, that make ungrateful man, wumble thy belly full, spit fire, spout wane. Oh dear, 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 says Mrs. Fidget, that will never do. Wumble thy belly full, spit fire, and spout wane? Who ever heard of such things? Better, my love, have done with that, and try the bard. But the bard, beginning, Ruin seize the ruthless king, put us too much in mind of wumble your belly full, to proceed with, and therefore little master was at last bidden to descend from such flights, and try his fable. But even his fable, which happened to be the first of gay, happening most unfortunately to begin with an R, his setting of here was as bad as ever, viz. Remote from cities lived a swain. However, he got through about 10 lines, making, as I observed, a dead pause at the end of every one, and not disposing very discreetly either of his accents or his stops, his delivery beginning as nearly as possible just as follows, his accents failing on the words printed in italics, and his pauses as noted by the perpendicular and horizontal bars. His head was silvered, or with age, and long experience made him sage. His honours in cheerful labours flew, nor envy nor ambition knew. At the beginning of every couplet, I also found his right arm regularly went up and precisely at the end and close of every rhyme came plump down again. Most happily, at the 11th line, the young gentleman's miraculous memory was nonplussed, and neither mamma nor any of his sisters, nor either of the pug dogs, could at all help him out. Thinks I to myself, I could if I would, but I did not. Would you? N.B. There were 70 more lines to come, and an R in almost every one of them, and time as usual, flying briskly all the while. This stop and impediment, however, was fatal to the young orator's progress, and therefore at last, Mrs. Fidget being rested, they all prepared to go. Thinks I to myself, now my poor mother will be happy again. But she, good soul, seemed to have got quite fond of them in consequence of the extraordinary length of their stay. She could not now so easily part with them. She was sure Mrs. Fidget could not be thoroughly rested. The clock had but just struck 2. If they would but stay a little longer, my father would be come home from his ride, and he would be greatly mortified to miss seeing them. But nothing would do. Go they must. Thinks I to myself, now a fig for your friendship, Mrs. Fidget. What? Not stay when my mother so earnestly presses it? Not stay when she declares your going will mortify my worthy father? No, nothing would stop them. Away they went. Not, however, indeed, without sundry promises on their part soon to call again, and divers most earnest entreaties of my mother's on no account to forget it. They were scarce gone out of the front door before my father entered. Are they really all gone at last? Says he. I thought they would have stayed till doomsday. Who in the world were they all? Oh dear, says my mother. Why, Mrs. Fidget and her tribe, girls and boy, and 2 pug dogs. Thank my stars I escaped them, says my father. Thinks I to myself, great symptoms of mortification my dear father shows at having had the misfortune to miss seeing them. I declare, says my mother, it is abominable to break in upon one in this manner. It was impossible to entertain such a group. So while Mrs. Fidget and I were in conversation, her young people and the dogs had nothing to do but to tease the bird and dirty the furniture. That little monkey of a boy is always in mischief. I could freely have boxed his ears. I thought he would have killed my poor bird. I was in the midst of a letter to Caroline, and now it's too late for the post. How Mrs. Fidget can spend all her time in visiting and walking about in the manner she does, I cannot conceive. I am to take it as a great and singular favour, she tells me, as she always does every time she comes, thinking, I suppose, that I don't know she is never at home. I think she'll lose that boy. I never saw such a puny, sickly child in my life. Thinks I to myself, oh, poor Mrs. Fidget, fine stout boy of his age. My father, with a great deal of good breeding in general, was a plain, blunt man in the mode of expressing his sentiments, so that my mother had scarcely finished what she had to say, but my father burst out, tiresome woman, says he, she ought to be confined. She's always wandering about with a tribe of children and dogs at her heels. There's poor Mrs. Creepmouse is quite ill from her visits. You know what a nervous creature she is. My father would have gone on ever so long, probably, in this strain, had not the servant entered with a note, which my mother immediately opened and read aloud, the contents being to the following effect. Mr. and Mrs. Meakin present their compliments to Mr. and Mrs. Dermont, and shall be extremely happy to have the honour of their company to dinner on Saturday next at 5 o'clock. Thinks I to myself, how civil, polite, and obliging. The servant was ordered to withdraw and tell the messengers to wait. As soon as he was gone, goodness, says my father, those people will never let us alone. Surely we dined there last. My mother thought not. My father thought they were forever dining there. My mother convinced him, by a reference to her pocket-book, that Mr. and Mrs. Meakin were quite right as to the balance of debtor and creditor. Well, only take care, says my father, that we do not get into a habit of dining there above once or twice a year at the utmost. It is really too great a sacrifice. What, do you mean to go, then? Says my mother. Go, says my father. Why, I suppose we must. I wish they were further, says my dear mother. I wish they were in Jericho, says my dear father. I had rather do anything than go on Saturday, says my mother. I had rather be hanged than ever go, says my father. It is such an intolerable bore. Well, says my mother, but the servant's waiting. So she took the pen, and away she wrote 2 or 3 lines in a moment. "There," she says to my father, "will that do?" Thinks I to myself, short and sharp, probably. My father, happily for me, read it aloud. "Mr. and Mrs. Dermont return their compliments to Mr. and Mrs. Meakin, and will wait upon them with the greatest pleasure on Saturday to dinner." Thinks I to myself, "Well done, my sweet-tempered mamma, how mild and how forgiving." But my father surprised me most. Instead of throwing it into the fire, as I expected, he declared it would not only do, but do vastly well. He therefore sealed it himself, rang the bell, gave it to the servant, and desired that he would give the best compliments. "And mind," says he, "you ask the servant how they all do. Be sure you make him understand." Thinks I to myself, what heavenly mindedness, what Christian charity. I expected the servant every moment to return with an account of our friend's health, but no such thing. My father and mother seemed to have quite forgot they had made the inquiry. I ventured to remind them of the servant's neglect. "Ah," said my father, "my boy, you don't know the world." Thinks I to myself, what's that to the purpose? But I never went further than necessary. It seemed unaccountable to me what could be the nature of my father's and mother's sentiments and feelings to send with such earnestness to ask how their friends did, and never want an answer. However, the servants did return soon after to bring some sandwiches, and my mother immediately asked him whether he had been careful to inquire how they all were, which the servant answered in the affirmative. "Well," thinks I to myself, "how are they all then?" No, not a word further. Dead or alive, it seemed to be all one to my father and my mother, and the servant. Not an item about the health of master or mistress, son or daughter, though I knew there was a house full of them. Thinks I to myself, as sure as can be, that fellow knows something of the world. But my contemplations were again broken in upon by the entrance of the servant with another note, which my mother broke open as she had done the other, and read as before. "Sir Henry and Lady Lydiard beg the favour of Mr. and Mrs. Dermont's company to dinner at 5 o'clock on Saturday next." Thinks I to myself, what's to be done now? "Let the man wait," says my mother. "Was ever anything so unlucky, Mr. Dermont? Had it come but a moment sooner, we should have been totally disengaged." "The deuce take the Meakins," says my father. "What can we do?" says my mother. "Go by all means," says my father, "and send an excuse to the others." "But it will be so rude," says my mother. "Oh, never mind that," says my father. "Write a note, and I'll send it." "But what can I say?" says my mother. "Oh, say we were previously engaged and had forgot," says my father. Thinks I to myself, what a bounce. "Well, but then we must accept this invitation," says my mother. "By all means," says my father. "We always meet a pleasant party at Sir Henry's." So a note was written, which I neither saw nor heard, but I dare say it expressed great pleasure at being completely at liberty to wait upon them, for that seemed to be the reply they had agreed upon between themselves. The next thing was to write an excuse to the others. Thinks I to myself, how will my dear mamma manage that? Says my mother, "To be sure, if we can get off, it will be delightful." "Get off," says my father, "we must get off. It is bore enough in common to go there, but to give up a pleasant party at Sir Henry Lydiard's to dine humdrum with the Meakins is too much." By this time my mother had made some progress in her note of apology. Thinks I to myself, to be sure she is telling the exact truth, for she takes no time to frame any fudge or falsehood. Well, it soon was finished, and as soon read to my worthy father, while I had the happiness to hear and to treasure up the exact contents of it. They were, I apprehend, precisely as follows. Mr. and Mrs. Dermont present their compliments to Mr. and Mrs. Meakin, are extremely sorry and concerned to be under the necessity of informing them that when they answered their obliging and kind invitation for Saturday, they had by accident forgotten a previous engagement to dine at Sir Henry Lydiard's, which will entirely prevent them from the great pleasure they had promised themselves of dining on that day at Meakin Place. They hope another time to be more fortunate, as it is with extreme regret that they feel compelled to send this excuse.